cockatoo, and obviously one of the most important sessions that we can have in a forum like we've had over the last couple of days. The recovery of the species is what this is all about. In this session, we're going to hear from the Australian government and the recovery planning team, and the recovery planning for threatened species. So we'll also hear from the Conservancy, and we'll be sharing on our guidelines and our conservation guidelines that have been developed. And there'll be a panel to explore how we can ensure policy and planning protects glossy black cockatoos into the future. And yeah, it should be a very good and engaging session, that is for sure. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speakers, and the talks on recovery plans and conservation advices for Australia's threatened species. We're very fortunate to have Tim McGrath, who's a director, and Eloise Dowd, who's the Senior Conservation Policy Officer with the Protected Species and Ecological Community Grants with the federal government. And really, really happy to have you both with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. Appreciate that introduction. I'm just going to bring a slide up. I'll share our presentation. Awesome. Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much for inviting Eloise and I to the forum. Eloise has been present in and out and throughout the last couple of days. But firstly, yeah, big kudos to you guys as a group for organising such an event for this species. It's really exciting for us, and it reminds us as the Commonwealth Government, you know, with so many species that, you know, there's a lot of public interest in this species and a lot of great momentum and championship behind it, which is really important for threatened species recovery. So that's really great. And I'm going to give you a bit of a high level sort of introduction to our section and branch, and to give you some context, given that we'll be working with you closely over the next sort of while, and then I'll sort of hand it over to Eloise, and she'll be, you know, talking through the sort of recovery planning process. So firstly, I just wanted to sort of give you that really high level sort of snapshot of the department. So this is our organisational structure in the department, and I've just looked at the APS census report for our department, and figured out that there's 5,309 people that work in our department across the portfolios of environment, energy, climate change, and water. And I've highlighted there a little section there, the Protected Species and Communities branch. We're just one little section in a biodiversity division. And we work closely in the same division with the Threatened Species Commissioner, and who work towards the Threatened Species Action Plan. And we also work closely with the Biodiversity Program area, which administers the Natural Heritage Trust and Saving Native Species funding programs. So, yeah, we're just a small area in our team, in Eloise and mine's team. We've only got 15 people working on threatened species recovery planning, terrestrial threatened species. And above us sits, you know, 7 deputy secretaries, the secretary, and then who reports to the minister. And obviously that's important to know, because the minister is the one who makes recovery plans for threatened species at the end of the day, and collaborates across governments in making those plans. So we'll come back to that structure chart in a minute. But in terms of our section, our terrestrial threatened species section, we have a number of responsibilities. And that includes, firstly, getting priority species listed under the EPBC Act. And then what comes with that is conservation planning for those species under the EPBC Act. That is usually primarily conservation advices at the time of listing, and then where appropriate, recovery plans. We also work to manage and support the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, as they play a really key role in the development and approval and recommendations to the Environment Minister around recovery plans and conservation advices. We also, it's important to, we collaborate with the states and territories on directions and threatened species priorities and collaboration and stuff like that. And at the moment, we are quite sort of in the midst of contributing to and supporting EPBC reform, which I'm sure you've all heard about, but we've sort of finished stage 1 and 2 of EPBC reform, which is establishment of or in the process of an Environment Information Australia, a data sort of housing part of our department, and an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, an independent sort of cop on the beat. So, but now we're in this sort of working towards a stage 3 reform, which is changes to the Act. And obviously threatened species are a big part of the Act. So we play a big role in contributing to that, and particularly around modernising conservation planning documents. And we also support the Threatened Species Commissioner, who's responsible for those 110 or 20 priority species under the Threatened Species Strategy. And then importantly, we also support recovery teams and the registration of external recovery teams, and we support them in their needs and operation. So just a bit of a snapshot in terms of the glossy back cockatoo. I thought important to know where it sits. I've highlighted a few stats here, but it's one of 2,138 listed threatened species under the EPBC Act. And we also have another 138 species which we're assessing in the next 2 years under what we call a finalised priority assessment list approved by the Minister, to get another 138 species potentially on the EPBC Act, which is obviously concerning. But where the glossy black cockatoo sits, it's one of 76 vulnerable listed birds. There's 185 terrestrial birds listed under the EPBC Act, and fortunately enough, we're in the vulnerable category. You can see there we go up in the critically endangered category. We've got 17 species, 70 endangered birds. So that's just important to know, because obviously there's a big prioritisation process here. There's a big workload. There's a big job of threatened species, and it's great to know that there's such public interest and momentum and champions behind a vulnerable listed species, because at the moment, I suppose in a government context, we are really looking at prioritising, and we have a no more extinctions policy, and we have a Saving Our Native Species program to support that, and a lot of the emphasis is going to those critically endangered, and to stop that space. So we're really thankful and grateful that there's some great momentum behind this for such a vulnerable listed species, so that we don't see it stepping up that category to endangered and critically endangered. So our section really is focused at the moment in that workload and reform on ensuring that every species has a fit for purpose statutory document. So that's a document that can have the most conservation benefit. And we might ask why, and I just think these documents, recovery plans, are really important documents. They're used internally if we reflect on that big structure chart I showed earlier across the department. We're one little piece of the pie that develops this document, and they are used really importantly by our Nature Positive Regulation Division, which is a big division full of people that are assessing all the development approvals across Australia and across this species range. And the recovery plans play an important role in informing those environment assessments. They play an important role in compliance investigations. They play an important role in the monitoring and auditing of proponents. And obviously, they're a really important document for the Minister herself and the delegates to make decisions, because all throughout the script of the EPBC Act, there's references to recovery plans, and it varies to, they play a really important role in issuing permits, in making conservation agreements, in issuing waivers for things related to Commonwealth land. So they're really important document. And other uses are, they're really important for our biodiversity program area to inform decision making around the grants that become available, like the Natural Heritage Trust and Saving Our Native Species, about is the funding that we are going to administer and approve aligned with our recovery plans and the priority actions, and are they addressing the priority habitats and all that sort of stuff. And then more and more now, they're becoming more important in that sort of nature finance markets and emissions reduction space of our department, because a nature repair markets, we're looking at securing more land, important habitats, protecting more habitats, etc. And they can even play a really important role in our environmental water space when it comes to species, say in the Murray-Darling Basin catchment and stuff like that, around environmental flows and protection and stuff like that. And that's internally how they play a role. And then externally, our recovery plans, they help guide recovery teams. They give them a framework to track progress, to refer to all the time. They're used externally by all, a lot of the people that will be attending this forum, our NRM and regional delivery partners for restoration and protection purposes. They're used externally by developers to develop mitigation, avoidance, and look at offsets potentially if they get approved projects. State and local governments use them for their planning purposes. Really important in the forestry space. Recovery plans are a necessary consideration in regional forest agreements. The list goes on. They're important for philanthropy, like private investment, for protection, education. So that's just showing you the sort of use of those recovery plans. And then the last slide that I'll be talking to is just some really important context around just remembering as we move into a recovery planning space for the glossy black cockatoo is that conservation planning best practice sort of framework that goes behind recovery plans. And it's important to just reflect and remind ourselves that this was a species that were not listed until the 2019-2020 bushfires, and then as a response to that, the species was assessed, obviously, and it was listed in response to the bushfires, but it was only eligible under the IUCN Red List listing criteria due to the reasons associated with population decline and population size. So just reflecting on that, it's a numbers game for this. It's all about numbers and counts and individuals. And so that's where we need to be heading if we're writing a recovery plan with objectives to get this species off the list and remove it from the vulnerable list and recover it, then we have to meet that numbers game. We have to make sure that we've improved the numbers so that it's not eligible for those criteria. So that's just a reflection. It was listed under those two criteria relating to population size and decline. And so a conservation advice was developed for it in 2022. And then there was obviously a decision at that time, which Eloise is going to sort of follow on from now, to make a recovery plan. And she's going to sort of step you through that process. So I'll stop there, Eloise, and just stop sharing. And then you might want to just open up your version.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Thank you for that.
Just a reminder while Eloise brings her presentation up, if anybody has questions for Tim or Eloise, drop them in the chat, and Adrian, who's facilitating this session, will pass those on at the end of Eloise's presentation.
Okay, can you all see that?
Yep,
looks great. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly step through why a recovery plan is needed for the glossy black cockatoo and a little bit about the requirements under the Act. It's not as sexy as reports from the field with pretty photos, but I think it is really important to understand this process, both to get a sense of the timelines that we're talking about and how long it takes to get this through all the statutory requirements, and also for stakeholders to understand where they've got opportunity to input into the document and make a really robust plan. So why is a recovery plan needed? Well, the legislative reason is that the minister has decided that we need a recovery plan. And where that comes from is at the time of listing, the Threatened Species Scientific Committee will make a recommendation about whether they think a recovery plan is needed. And then the final decision rests with the minister, but they typically or always adopt the advice of the TSSC. And so for the glossy, reasons to have a recovery plan over just the conservation advice is it's a wide-ranging species. We've got many stakeholders and more management complexities than, say, if you're dealing with a species that's got a fairly limited distribution or is endemic to a particular state. So that provides us with a wider planning framework than a conservation advice. There's more opportunity for a consultation and to develop priority actions and timelines with implementers. And so that gives you an opportunity for a coordinated recovery response across multiple jurisdictions, as states and territories have the option to jointly make the plan with the Commonwealth. And also, this is a common trigger species for environmental assessments under the Act, primarily because of its range. And so once the recovery plan is made, the Minister cannot act inconsistent with that plan when approving projects. So it's a key consideration in environmental assessments. So in terms of what the process is for developing that recovery plan, I'm just going to step through a little timeline here. So once that decision is recommended by the TSSC to the Minister, she agrees that you need to make a plan. If agreed by the Minister, the drafting process begins. And so there's a 3-year time frame for completion for a plan that has the option to be extended for another 3 years. And that is very often what happens, because this process does take a long time, and because, as Tim mentioned, there's so many species on the list that we're in the process of recovery planning for. So there's always resource constraints around this. So the plan is developed with stakeholders. Consultation is a really key part of recovery plan and a legislative requirement. It doesn't have to be drafted by the department. Plans are often drafted by external agencies such as recovery teams or NGOs. Sometimes state governments will lead development of plans. And so once that draft is put together, there needs to be an agreement by the TSSC to put that draft out for public comment. So the TSSC meets, it's typically six to 8 times a year. So it's key to sort of meet certain deadlines to get that to that meeting and get agreement by them to send it out for public comment. And so then the plan must be open for public comment for 3 months. And this is the key period of time to provide feedback into the plan. All feedback needs to be considered, and we consolidate that feedback and incorporate it into the plan. If we don't incorporate it, we need to provide reasons why to the Minister. So it's a really important part of the process, and it's, other than that early development stage, this is really the final point in time when we can take on feedback for the plan. So once all of that is incorporated, it then goes back to the TSSC for endorsement. Once we've got an endorsed plan, it goes to the Minister. The Minister then must invite the relevant states and territories to jointly make the plan. So this extends the timeframe out a little bit as well. Not all states and territories will sign on, and it's not a requirement for the plan, but yeah, it's a good way to get, to align conservation priorities and work out implementation plans. And so once you've got final agreement by the Minister, plan's been made, it's lodged in the Federal Register of Legislation, it's now a statutory document. So in terms of the glossy black cockatoo plan, I'm going to go through where we're currently at. So the species has that current conservation advice in place. I think it was published 2022. So it's fairly updated. And so that acts as the statutory planning document until the recovery plan's made. There has been an early draft of the recovery plan completed. And then we're moving into this next step, which is something that Sam and Adrian will talk to a little bit after this, which is the development of the recovery team that will further develop that plan. So there's going to be plenty of opportunity for stakeholders to get involved in the plan once that team's been put together. And then once that draft's completed, we'll send it to TSSC for agreement to public consult. And then there's that additional opportunity for more feedback on the plan. That's it from us. I also just wanted to echo what Tim said, which it's really great for us to be here and listen to everything that's happening on the ground. You know, as you'll see from our amount of species that we work on, it's just not possible for us to be species experts in all these spaces, and it's just so important to have these forums get together and have everyone knowledge share. And yeah, just really appreciate it, Sam. Thank you, and everyone at the Conservancy.
Yes, and thank you both for your time, because we know how busy you guys are and you've got a lot of things to handle, and we're just one of many species, but your support and input's been very helpful, and yeah, really happy that you had the time and ability to come and present to this forum, because it is important and it is really critical for us all to have contact with you guys and for us all to know what everybody's doing and where everything's going. So yeah, that's wonderful. We've got a couple of questions have popped up. Do you want to take those now or leave them for a little bit later when the panels are all on? What?
Yeah, we can do it now.
Yeah. All right. There's it's a comment from Daniela. It's about sometimes conservation status and taxonomy are not considered independent. For example, maintaining subspecies or smaller population sizes may mean the subspecies remains listed, whereas the rest don't. It might seem preferable because it affords some statutory protection. However, the issue might arise if the two eastern subspecies of glossy blacks are eventually lumped together. Could potentially change the listing status of glossies, even if nothing else has changed on the ground. And what's your thoughts on that sort of change?
Yeah, Eloise, so I'm not familiar with the genetics and the subspecies.
Yeah.
But so we're saying here, at the moment, our listing covers the full range, is that right? And they could be split, is that what we're saying? Or it's currently split, but there's uncertainty around it. But there's uncertainty, and that might be then one species consideration.
Yes, yeah. That was the intent, wasn't it, Daniela?
Yeah, sorry if that wasn't super clear. I was sort of eating my lunch and typing.
All good.
Currently, we've got 3 subspecies of glossies. Obviously, Kangaroo Island is listed separately, and now the southeastern subspecies has been listed, and then we have this northern subspecies that is very poorly studied. We know nothing about it. And speaking to some taxonomists, there's potential that those 2 subspecies will become one down the track. And I guess then that will, of course, change the population size of this subspecies and its distribution, which then may mean that it doesn't meet the criteria for being listed any longer, even though actually on the ground nothing has changed. The birds are still just as threatened as they always were, but now they're a bigger population, so to speak. And so I've seen this kind of come up in other discussions where people, and I'm not saying this is my opinion, but people will kind of fight to maintain subspecies boundaries because it means that the birds then have more statutory protection because they will remain listed. So I don't really have a question per se. I'm just curious on your thoughts, because I think that's sometimes where, conservation status and listing becomes a bit muddled up in taxonomy.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. Yeah, I'm going to apologise that I don't know the complexities of the subspecies and that, but well, I could answer that or address it in a way is, it goes back to those criteria, the IUCN criteria. So what I said, this is under criteria 1 and criteria 3, the listing for the glossy back, my understanding. And so a lot of species under the EPBC Act are listed under criteria 2, which is extent of occurrence and area of occupancy and a restriction of that. And that often then changes if there's something like this that happens and the extent of occupancy goes, different, then there's changes. But I think we're lucky in this space because it's a numbers game, like I say. So if we can demonstrate decline, no matter what, like I'm assuming the northern species, given the threats have declined as well, they'll still be eligible under that decline. But even if not, there's a clause, because it's already listed now, there's a clause under the Act that the minister can't remove a species from the threatened species list if by removing that, there's still threats operating that would make it eligible in the future. So it's sort of a bit safe because we know this is a habitat loss issue driving population decline, and so the threats are still there. They need to be abated. So it's probably in a pretty safe space, I would think, in terms of not coming off the list, given it's a frequent trigger of the EPBC Act, and development is constantly putting pressure on its habitat and foraging resources, and
All right. And one other quick one from Liz Gould, and it's basically years ago, there was intent to prioritise funding the species that have recovery plans and recovery teams. Is that still the department's preferred approach? And if so, is funding distributed based on recovery actions and those sorts of capacity to deliver the actions?
Would you like me to talk to that, Eloise? Yeah.
Yeah, so there was intent to prioritise funding to species that were listed as priority species under the action plan, and that funding's been committed now. So that's 110 priority species and 20 priority places. Unfortunately, the glossy black is not one of those priority species. And then there was the Saving Native Species funding. As far as I'm aware, maybe you might know, Tim, that funding was not prioritised to species based on if they ever had a recovery plan or team. That funding primarily gets delivered out through the NRM regions, and a consideration is matters of national environmental significance, but that's all listed species. It doesn't have to be a species that has a recovery plan or a team. There was some funding committed just recently to developing recovery teams for a series of priority species. So that was to help a few organisations, including BirdLife, to employ recovery action coordinators, I think is the term they used for it, to help develop out these teams and support those actions. So hopefully that answers your question. I guess the short answer is no.
Yep. One other very, very quick question, and it's a good thing to just reiterate and have understanding of. It's from Spencer up at Save the Sunshine Glossies, and it's basically, what happens if a government changes? Will this affect the recovery plan if it's not complete?
Short answer, no. There's been a decision made that for a recovery plan. It is possible technically for a minister to reverse a recovery plan decision. And that's a pretty complex legislative process. There would need to be a lot of appetite to do that. Yeah, and if recovery plans are already in train, I mean, those kind of decisions take many, many years to go through. So it wouldn't, even if the government changes next year, that's not going to affect this recovery plan.
I certainly don't know, but I can't think of too many examples where a new minister's come in and completely undone recovery plans and, you know, completely rechanged what species and species priorities and actions are going, because it's a fairly dangerous thing for a environment minister to be doing, because they're asking for a lot of blowback if that happens.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
and then right. that did happen under the previous government. There was some reversals of recovery plan decisions. That process did go through the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, and there were primarily species that had a recovery plan decision made when the EPBC Act was first in place, prior to there being amendments to the Act, which allowed for species to have a conservation advice as opposed to a recovery plan. But yeah, that's the only recent example I can think of where decisions are being reversed. And though all of those species continue to be listed on the threatened species list, and they all continue to require a conservation planning document in place.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, guys. That's really good, and I'm sure everyone's found it very informative, and gives us a lot of understanding of how you guys sit, where you sit in the big scheme of things, and hopefully some understanding that your unit, as important as it is only 7 people, and you can only do so much and rely on others to help out with delivering some of the actions that are required in the overall scheme of things. All right, we'll have a panel later. If the 2 of you are able to, or at least one of you, are able to hang around later for the panel, there's likely to be some value in throwing a question or two over to you guys.
Yep,
if it's
definitely
relevant directly to your department. Yeah. All right. So next up, we have Appleton from BAM. He's going to be giving an outline and an overview of the Glossy Black Conservancy's conservation guidelines for the glossy black cockatoo. Jed was instrumental in pulling it together with Daniela, and it's a document that we're very proud of the outcomes that have come. So I will turn it over to Jed.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, so today I'll briefly discuss the Glossy Black Conservancy's conservation guideline document. and I'll also touch on how this document may inform future recovery planning processes for the southeastern subspecies of glossy black cockatoo, which is obviously the focus of this session and the panel session at the end. So just for some background for those who aren't aware of the document, the Glossy Black Conservancy was formed in 2005, and at the time the vision was to enable a coordinated approach between government, community and business to increase the awareness, protection and conservation of glossy black cockatoos in southeast Queensland. The geographical scope of the Conservancy was soon extended to include far northeastern New South Wales in recognition of a requirement for a truly coordinated approach that extended beyond state borders. The Conservancy soon acknowledged that despite the species being listed as threatened in Queensland and New South Wales, and although southeast Queensland and far northeastern New South Wales have some of the most significant populations of the southeastern subspecies in Australia, no integrated protection programs or recovery plans existed for the species in the region, which represented a significant conservation barrier. To address the lack of an established plan of management, a conservation guidelines document was developed and published in 2010, led by Dr. Penn Lloyd from the Conservancy. The long-term goal of the conservation guidelines was to facilitate the conservation of viable populations of glossy black cockatoo across southeast Queensland and far northeastern New South Wales. This was to be achieved through improving knowledge and understanding of the ecological interactions between glossy black cockatoos and both natural and modified environments, identifying threats to glossy black cockatoo persistence across southeast Queensland and far northeastern New South Wales and priority actions for conservation, providing stakeholders with relevant information to develop and implement strategic adaptive management actions and associated monitoring regimes that achieve the conservation objectives of the glossy black cockatoo and its habitats, assisting the implementation of management actions by coordinating a consistent collaborative approach and effort by stakeholders, and raising public awareness of the glossy black cockatoo, the threats it faces, and the priority actions required to ameliorate these threats. In terms of content, the conservation guidelines are intended to be basically a compendium of current knowledge about glossy black cockatoos and their conservation needs, specifically in southeast Queensland and far northeastern New South Wales. More specifically, it includes a comprehensive species profile, including species and subspecies descriptions, information on species ecology, including preferred habitat, diet and foraging habits, reproduction and development, movement patterns and behavioural traits, a description of recognised threats, including removal and modification of feeding habitat, climate change, drought and fire, removal of nesting trees and drinking sites, and other threats to breeding success. It also includes descriptions of current and recent research, including nesting behaviour, bioacoustic monitoring methods, fire impacts on feeding habitat, feed tree selection and preservation of viable feeding habitat, and climate change adaptation. It includes an overview of current mechanisms for black cockatoo species more generally, including monitoring and recovery, legislation protection and regulation, habitat mapping and spatial prioritisation, fire planning, food tree planting, artificial nest hollows, protecting nests from predation, nest monitoring, bird counts, and captive populations. This culminates in a list of conservation goals and broad management actions, which have been structured in relation to the recognised threats and categorised into research and monitoring, statutory planning and regulation, and land management and on-ground works. The current document, which is version 2, represents the first revision of the conservation guidelines. This anticipated the subspecies listing as threatened at the national level, and the updated document includes new research findings about the species and threats to its status and recovery, updated information about existing and potential mechanisms for species protection and recovery, and a revised list of broad actions for research, regulatory planning policy, and general land management based on known threats and knowledge gaps. I'd just say at this point, while I was responsible for coordinating the update to the document, I'd certainly like to acknowledge the contribution of all Conservancy partners to this update, particularly the significant input from Daniela, who undertook the majority of background research and provided the majority of the updated content. Thanks, Daniela. The broad management actions provided are not intended to be prescriptive. Instead, they're provided to inform the development of more specific action plans by and for relevant stakeholders, and to enable the allocation of resources to undertake a focused and collaborative management effort across the South East Queensland and Far North East New South Wales regions. Stakeholders willing and able to be involved are encouraged to prepare more detailed action plans relevant to their objectives and responsibilities, and to prioritise actions on the basis of the known or likely impact of the corresponding threat to the species. Although the conservation guidelines are focused on the management of the southeastern subspecies across southeast Queensland and far northeastern New South Wales, the document includes most of the background information typically found within a recovery plan for a species or subspecies in general, and in doing so provides a useful basis for a national recovery plan for the southeastern subspecies. We note the draft National Recovery Plan references the Conservancy's original conservation guideline document, and we certainly took the opportunity to undertake a collaborative review and provide comprehensive comments on the draft plan in early 2023. As identified and emphasised in the conservation guidelines, key strategies for recovery planning should include the identification and protection of foraging and breeding habitat, particularly known and suitable feed trees and nesting trees, and addressing the impacts of climate change, bushfire and drought through a collaborative and prioritised approach to research and monitoring, statutory planning and regulation, and incentivised land management and on-ground works. I hope that gives everyone a good summary of the document and hopefully how it might be able to inform a national recovery plan.
Thanks, Jed. That was a very good summary of the conservation guidelines. And yeah, it's a document the Conservancy is very proud of. And, you know, I know I speak on behalf of everyone, the work that the team that were working on it and the quality of the document's very impressive and a very valuable document indeed. And like you say, already forms a good basis of information for a recovery plan. I didn't see any questions for Jed, or have I missed them?
I should point out too that the conservation guideline, it's available on the Conservancy's website. I think Sam's put that in the chat there.
Yeah,
we have started to make a couple of minor updates. The document was finalised just before the species was listed as threatened at the national level, so we've sort of started making some updates to reflect that. But otherwise, the content of the guidelines stayed the same.
Yeah. All right. I reckon you're getting off scot-free, mate. No questions for you. Well, someone had at least asked what's on page 5. Here we go. Eloise has spoken in. So do you think the guidelines are the most applicable across the rest of the species range?
Yeah, certainly parts of it would be. There are obviously some of the content is specific to Southeast Queensland and far northeastern New South Wales, and you know the studies that have been taken there specifically. I'm sure some of that would be applicable to the rest of the range, but that would have to be sort of reviewed and checked with other experts in other areas.
Mm-hmm. And Liz Gould has asked, is there a plan to update, which you've alluded to that you are doing some updates to it in line with changes in status?
Yes.
Yeah, to see what happens, or are you going to wait to see what happens with the recovery plan? So
I think we started doing those updates and then realised that you know the National Recovery Plan was in train, and we might have a role in progressing that as well. So it's sort of on hold at the moment.
Yep. Other question from Daniela was, how have the guidelines been received by councils? And do you have any feel for that?
I don't actually. I'd be interested to hear from any council representatives as to whether that's the case. I certainly hope so. We have a lot of council representatives on the Conservancy, so it'd be nice to hear from them as to whether they've been adopted by councils or how they're being used.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm certainly aware of some councils use it to guide their development assessments. They haven't put it in as policy, or they haven't put it into their planning schemes as such, but they were certainly using it. And Sam has just pointed out that our council partners are screaming for an updated version. So we're pretty sure that that's something they want to, ultimately put into their development application processes. But yeah, I certainly know that, quite a few of the councils, some of the officers are aware of the document and have the document and are using it to inform, I guess, information responses that they're asking in regards to specific development applications. So, all right. So, thank you for that, Jed. That's really good. I think I got everybody. Oh, we got a question. Oh no, it's a statement from Spencer, and it was just disappeared. He's just saying he thinks habitat protection is the most important thing we can do for the species. Is that something you think's important?
Yes, of course. That is probably the most important thing. And I know the work going into the habitat mapping and things like that is certainly aimed at identifying what is critical habitat for the species and where are the priority areas for protection.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, mate. That's brilliant. All right. So in some of you may have picked up on it, or some of you may have missed it, but Eloise just alluded to or advised us of some exciting news that we've got for everybody. As we all know, the southeastern glossy black cockatoo was listed as vulnerable under the EPBC Act in August of 2022. At the time it was listed, a recovery plan was identified as being required. It was also then listed as vulnerable in the Nature Conservation Act in April, and it was listed as vulnerable in New South Wales in September 2024 under the Biodiversity Conservation Act. Conservation advice for the species became effective on the 10th of August 2022, and a draft recovery plan was done by the Department of Climate Change and Energy and Environment and Water, in 2023. And that had some targeted consultation done. There was responses for that haven't been further incorporated into the draft recovery, and it didn't go through to the public sector or for consultation, and that hasn't happened with that plan yet. And as you just heard from Jed, the Conservancy has put together the conservation guidelines, but that's targeted for southeast Queensland and northeastern New South Wales. We've been liaising with the department over the last few months and talking about the species, and we've had some very productive interaction with the department, and I do want to acknowledge Tim and Eloise and how open they've been in discussions and giving us feedback and helping us with discussions about having a recovery team getting up and running. And I'm very happy to announce that we've been invited for the Glossy Black Conservancy to convene a recovery team and get the Glossy Black Cockatoo recovery plan happening. And this is be the first formalised recovery team for the southeastern glossy black cockatoo. And I think that is very big news and a wonderful thing for us to have. And we're very excited to have that being able to be announced as part of this forum. It's very big news indeed. We want to get a very effective team in place, and we envisage a recovery team comprising approximately 10 or so people. And because we want it to be a fairly tight-knit group that have got a mission, and the mission is to get a recovery plan pulled together and out. We will be asking for at least 2 or 3 people by way of expression of interest for the to join the team. And as you know from being here in the last few days, there are a lot of people out there that have great skills, knowledge and value to a recovery team or the recovery planning process. We see this team meeting virtually primarily and meeting on a monthly basis because we want to keep it moving and keep it all rolling along. That team's going to facilitate the involvement and engagement of as many organisations, individuals as we possibly can, because we want to have the widest support for the strategies that are included in the plan. We will certainly have subcommittees working behind the recovery team on specific themes or specific areas that need to be considered and addressed to make recommendations back up to the recovery team. Now, obviously, a recovery team, one of the critical roles is the chair and having a good chair of a recovery team. We need someone who's across all the latest knowledge of the species, all the research that's happening with the species, is well connected with people who are in the industry and working with the species and knows various aspects of recovery planning, application of prioritisation, and someone who's able to motivate and lead others in recovery planning. And it's with honour and I'm very thrilled to announce that we've decided to appoint Daniela Texera as the Glossy Black Cockatoo Recovery Team's interim chair, because we see Danny as ticking all the above criteria. The Conservancy is going to be facilitating the recovery team, but it's ultimately up to the recovery team to consider and look at their structure and how they're going about their business. And the recovery team will formally appoint a chair at their first meeting. So we're putting Danny in as an interim role to help get the team together and start getting the ball rolling and all of that. So in establishing that recovery team, we're in the process of drafting terms of reference, and they're almost complete, and we'll have them out and circulated to a few key people for comments in coming weeks. We've reached out to all the state government partners to seek their involvement. We're very keen to have a representative from the state governments and the federal governments on the team to give us input from their end and to make sure that the end product is something that they're happy with and can ultimately start adopting themselves. And yeah, we plan to work very closely with the Australian government's threatened species team about those changes to the recovery planning and the recovery plan itself. The call for expressions of interest for people who are interested in being on the recovery team, we will have that out before the end of the year. I'm a bit nervous saying that because the end of the year is so close it's going to hit us, but if it's not out at the end of this year, it'll certainly be very early in the next year. We want to have a very comprehensive consultation process as part of this, and it's really because we know a recovery plan, a recovery team, and the end product is only going to be better if it's supported by all of you and by all of us who are here today who are involved in the species, the research, the management and the recovery actions. It's going to take all of us to get something together, and we're all going to have to support the recovery plan and the actions that are coming with it. So one of the reasons we pulled this forum together was to increase connections and increase everybody's understanding of who's doing what out there in the world of glossies, and for us all to start meeting each other and to have better connections. And the spreadsheet that's getting created with everybody's contact details is going to be very helpful, because I know everybody's keen to talk more with different people about some of the things they've heard over the last couple of days. But yeah, if you're not on the recovery team, you're still an important person in its ultimate success. Once we get that recovery plan done and it's endorsed, it's going to take the whole sector to deliver on the recommended actions and to be reporting back on the outcomes of those actions. And it's going to be critical to our understanding of the recovery team and the actions that are in there and how successful those actions have been. So yeah, absolute pleasure to announce Danny as the interim chair, and we're looking forward to engaging with all of you in the development of the recovery plan as we go forward. So overall, it's our intent, and it's important. The recovery plan is going to be a catalyst for improved policy and investment in recovery actions for our beloved glossy black cockatoos. Anyone's got any questions about that? We're about to have a panel and all answer questions, but you're also welcome at any time to contact us via our email, which is info@glossyblack.org.au, or you can come in via our website, or you're welcome to contact myself, Danny, Sam, Ellie, Jed, anybody who's involved in the Conservancy. If you've got any questions about the recovery team and the recovery plan going forward, we're only too happy. The whole thing's about having you guys involved and having input and review on it. So that's where we're at. And I think it's a wonderful story. I think it's great news.
Lots of positive comments in the chat and a couple of questions. Guy Cooper's also going to be joining. Guy Castley is going to be joining the panel if he would like to turn his camera on so I can add him. So Liz Gould has actually asked, this is a question for the DQ team, is there funding for the 3-year development timeframe for recovery plans? Tim's just shaking heads, haven't even turned their mics on.
No, there isn't any specific funding to support recovery teams, but there is some sectional money as part of our section that can go to helping with components and supporting, like Eloise mentioned before, like maybe some support for Indigenous consultation, or some other form, like it might be some exercise to workshop habitat and habitat critical or something like that. We could support in small ways, I think, but there's no bigger national funding sort of process, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Eloise?
Yeah. Just encourage the recovery team to think about if there's key activities, particularly things like Indigenous engagement, to get in touch with us about what exactly the activity would be and what kind of bucket you're thinking about. So yeah, just definitely get in touch with us so we can throw that stuff up the chain and do what we can to try and get you supported.
Thanks, Eloise. And then Liz has just made a comment that it's tragic that threatened species recovery, like so many environmental activities, is reliant on volunteers, and shout out to all the citizen scientists who were in our late night session last night, because that definitely drove home how critical all of those citizen scientists are to collecting data and keeping things ticking along. If anyone's got any questions go ahead, Tim. Yep.
Yes, I was just going to say, but I can note, can I note just to say that we know, like we said, like this is pretty unique for a species to have such a great group of people and a conservancy and a model behind it and momentum, that we will push for. It is possible. We'll push for as much support as we can get, because we have in the past, we outsource and procure particularly Indigenous-led recovery plans, for sums up to $50,000-$60,000 for their external development. Golden-shouldered parrots, stuff like that we've just released some really great new plans. So we will push for that. I'll let you know. We'll sort of, because of the understanding we've got, such momentum and opportunity here, that we'll take that to our executives.
That's great. And that's a great testament to everybody who's shown up and stayed online for 2 whole days. So thank you to all 67 people online at the moment. If anyone's got any questions for anyone on the panel, including Danny, who'll be leading that as interim chair of the recovery team, and Guy, who you would have met facilitating a number of sessions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we were just going to facilitate a bit of a conversation with our panelists around recovery planning and what it might mean for the species. So I was going to start by asking Danny, because you are, always the accidental pin-up girl for glossy black cockatoos, what do you think recovery planning might actually mean in terms of action or changes for the glossy black cockatoo and its status and recovery?
It's a huge question, Sam. Where do I begin? I've been giving this obviously a lot of thought over the last couple of months as we've been discussing this. I think it's going to be, and I haven't actually chaired a recovery team before. I've been involved in other recovery teams. So my role will be a little bit different, but I think we're going to have to work really hard to strike that right balance between planning and actually doing something. So we don't want to, and I mean, I sort of alluded this to in my talk yesterday. We don't want to just be writing plans, you know, doing all of the paperwork, so to speak. Like I really, really am serious about trying to inform on-ground action. It's not, yeah, a piece of paper might mean nothing to these birds, but we need to really get it right so that it actually has power to inform on-ground actions. Otherwise, it's not really doing much. And I think, unfortunately, there's far too many examples of species, not just in Australia, but around the world, that have been listed, that have had conservation plans developed for them, and then nothing has actually changed. And in some cases, those species have gone extinct, even though all of the statutory things are in place. So I think this is a real opportunity. We're starting, you know, not totally from scratch, but almost from scratch. And I think we can make this a really, really powerful team and a really powerful document. I hope so. And that's what I'm really inspired to do. So I'm really keen to hear from other people as well, what they think sort of forms an effective recovery team and plan. I've already started chatting to some other people who have far more experience in actually leading these things than me. So I've got a lot to learn, but yeah, certainly really motivated to make some on-ground change.
That's great, Danny. And Guy, I'm going to ask you that same question in a moment, but I also just wanted to put it out there for everyone that's participating. We'd love to hear your vision for this recovery plan. If you feel like dropping a couple of statements in the chat, Harry Hackett, who's on the management committee for the Conservancy, said we need to be writing those applications for on-ground works now and not short-term funding, but multi-year for maximum impact. And obviously working more cohesively together as a sector should help us do that. Guy, what do you think recovery planning might potentially mean for the glossy black cockatoo?
Yeah, I was going to hop in anyway after Danny's comments, and I agree. It is a complex mix of things that we need to consider, given the range of the species when we're looking at, you know, it's spreading all the way from Victoria up into Queensland kind of things. And well, I think one of the most important things for the recovery plan is that we're basing the recommendations and the decisions that we're putting in place for the species to be based on sound evidence and best information and knowledge that we have at our disposal. And that's going to be guided by the research that's been done all around the country, looking at what the requirements for the species are in different areas, because they are subtle differences in different places. You know, they feed on different species down south, they feed on different species in Queensland, and those requirements and the subtle differences in what those requirements are in different areas may need to have kind of bespoke actions on the ground in those kind of local areas. So while we might have a national plan that looks at what's happening for the species more broadly, we need to still be able to consider what the requirements are in those local areas. And that's where input from community groups that are working in those areas to monitor their local populations is going to be important. But the recommendations and the strategies we put in place need to be underpinned by that background research and knowledge and science to make sure that the decisions we're making are well informed and strategic in that sense. But I would also like to think that one of the key things with the plan that we can develop from the plan is that it is an instrument that we can use to make sure that we hold any kind of development or developers to account, and that it's not so easy to go ahead and carry on with clearing, you know, whereas in the past, maybe they will be able to have done some development because we didn't have a plan in place or we didn't have the species listed. Developments went ahead because they were able to get around it in some other way. So I'm hoping that the plan is a document and a mechanism that basically says that certain activities are not acceptable regardless of what, you know, we would like to see. You know, so yes, it's great to have development in certain places, but it needs to be in appropriate areas. And if an area is really critical for glossy black cockatoo, then it needs to be for glossy black cockatoo and not a housing development. And that's where the plan can be put in place to identify those critical resources where we say this is not negotiable. You know, we've lost enough habitat, we've lost enough of this particular resource in these areas, and the plan is there to provide the resources and the evidence to suggest that we need to look at alternatives. And that's where the plan, and I think we raised this in some of the previous discussions around comments on the draft, you know, we need to put instruments in place that don't provide loopholes rather than providing assurances and protections for species.
Thanks, Guy. Tim, you had something to add to that?
Yeah, and I was just going to say it's a really good question, an interesting discussion, and it goes to my point about fit for purpose conservation planning documents, and too many plans in historically have gone on the shelf and they sit dust and gather dust and nothing happens, and so we've got a really new focus as a department in making sure that these are effective documents, that they don't, and so comes down to exactly that. And I'm sure you as a group have talked about all this, like the causes and your key priorities and your objectives and all that stuff. But, I think it is really about figuring out how you want this document to be used. And so therefore, like what your big issues are, because it is a legislative document. It's different to those guidelines that you've developed because it's a legislative instrument under national environmental law, and it can be quite powerful. So it's about you figuring out, where do you get your biggest gain, conservation gain, and like things like, do we really need to be very clear around interaction in the forestry sector here? Is it all about loss of habitat, or is it, like just figuring out what it is? And then it's a really hard balance too, because these documents, they just need to have the right kind of information and useful information for those end users. They're recovery plans per se. They're not documents that say what's acceptable and unacceptable. We've got to be really careful with that line, because the EPBC Act has a process about making calls on significant impacts and what acceptable actions of development are. And this plan can't say that, because the significant impact is one that is dependent on the magnitude, the context of an action. It's a separate decision-making process. So we need to provide the tools for those people. So to me, it comes down to very clear, articulated habitat critical to the survival descriptions, identifying areas that are important for long-term climate refuges or restoration, and making them really clear, articulating them. If that's where you think you can have your biggest impact, if habitat loss is your biggest impact, or, you could switch it around, like other black cockatoos, like Western Australia black cockatoos have done a lot of work on those. Recovery groups have worked out it's a numbers game. It's mortality of females by getting hit by trucks and cars that's really driving population decline. So their conservation strategy is about targeting those exact issues and providing the right messages around those things, so that when it's used, it's clear, it's not certain, the minister can't act inconsistently with that information. So yeah, a bit of a ramble there, sorry, but it really comes down to you guys working around how can you be most effective, how's this document going to be used, who do you want to use it, and then making sure the right information's in there. And then,
thanks, Tim. I'm going to go to
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, and then as a recovery team, you can work with us to make sure that we're notifying you of all the funding opportunities, the next round, because our funding cycles happen in 3 or 4 years, the next program, hooking you up with that as a recovery team, and then implementing those things and getting the money for them.
Yeah, we look forward to that part. Thanks, Tim. Eloise has a hand up, and I'm going to come to you next, Eloise, but I just want to give the panel a heads up that the next question I'm going to ask you is what lessons we might have learned from recovery planning for other species, so especially Guy and Danny and Adrian. So Eloise.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on from Tim's thoughts about thinking about end users for this document. There's such a balancing act with recovery plans, because you've got multiple end users. We often end up getting caught up talking about the regulatory aspects, but that is just one element of recovery planning for species. But regulators are one of the end users of this, but there's also everyone else who's not in the regulatory space. And so it's about trying to create that balance of addressing all of those end users without being, especially when we're thinking about habitat and things, we want a good amount of detail in there to inform conservation and also inform investment. But we don't want to be overly prescriptive to the point where the information can be interpreted in a way that's not actually useful for conservation of the species in the regulatory space. I had one other thought. What was it? Oh God, it's going.
Well, we can come back to that. There've been a couple of comments in the chat as well.
Sorry,
go Eloise. Yeah.
I think one thing that has happened in the past with, because there's not a set template for recovery plans, there's like some requirements under the Act, but they can sort of really shift and change based on the species and the people working on it, is people can get overly bogged down in thinking like this has to be the primary document for a species, and it doesn't. So then you end up putting a lot of work into thinking about third tier priority actions and that kind of stuff, when it's just, it needs to be focused, like really clear and focused on what are the key drivers of decline and how can we address it.
Thanks. That's great advice, Eloise. We asked people to share with us what they were hoping the recovery plan might do, or what it might focus on, or what it might result in. And Barbara said that she'd really love to see collaboration and communication across the range of the species. And Sally Louise has said that she thinks that we need to be including and involving First Nations people with their knowledge and expertise, especially in relation to cool burns that could protect the she oaks and nests. So I wanted to ask Adrian, I don't know if you want to kick off this, but recovery planning for other species, have you come across any that have worked really well? Have you seen any that are absolute disasters? Are there any lessons we can learn from the process other people have gone through for recovery planning?
Oh, look, there are a lot of recovery plans out there, and I think if everybody just thinks about how many of them have you actually seen or had to do anything with, and that kind of answers a lot of the question. That it's really good to be able to say, oh, we need to have better protection of eucalyptus forests or something for this species, or whatever the species is. But you know, recovery plans, for me, you need to know how it's going to be used, who's going to use it, how they're going to use it, and have targets in there that are measurable. And for me, one of the biggest fall downs, and this is not sort of criticism of the department or anybody or other recovery teams, but putting the document out's one thing, but doing the follow-up monitoring and measuring of how successful the actions have been, or where it's falling down, is one of the most important things in a recovery plan. Is, all right, these are the things we recognise need to happen, and then are they happening or aren't they happening, and why aren't they happening? That's the stuff that ultimately needs to come through of a recovery plan. And unfortunately, for a lot of the recovery plans, it's sort of, they're a bit, I'll use the term motherhood statements. They sort of talk about all the things they aspire to without actually locking anyone down to having to do it in any way. And some of it's very difficult for, say, like a state government to adopt that plan, because it conflicts so much with many other things that they're on and involved with. So it's got to have that kind of flexibility that it's one of the factors when someone's making a decision, but it's there in front of them. It's not something that's, oh yeah, there is a plan, but we can just carry on and make our decision.
Thanks, Adrian. Nicole from Logan City Council's also popped in the chat that she'd love to see some specific advice and training packages for local government fire planning teams and on-the-ground fire crews. Guy, what about you? What have you seen from recovery planning for other species, and what might we learn from those experiences?
Not much at all, since I haven't been on very many of the other recovery plans for other species. I think it is a challenge, and I think from experience with dealing with other threatened species management in other countries and other places and stuff, a lot of it does depend on context, and I think it's what Adrian has alluded to, is that if we can take the Glossy as an example. So we have a recovery plan, or we had a recovery plan in place for the subspecies on Kangaroo Island, and that worked. I think that probably worked quite well, because they knew what the issue was that was impacting that particular population on Kangaroo Island. So they were able to put an action in place that dealt with that specific predation threat on the birds on KI. And we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of chick survival and the population recovery since then. So the team that was involved, plus a clear and good understanding of what the threats were that were facing that particular population. When we translate that through to what's happening with the southeastern population, it's across a much bigger range. We don't really have a good understanding of what particular threats may be an impact for specific local populations. And predation rates and risk to chicks in nests may not be an issue for much of this population. We heard from some of the talks yesterday that the nests that's being monitored at the moment don't seem to have been predated. We don't yet have a good understanding of nest success from those particular hollows. Maybe feeding habitat might not be limiting, but nesting hollows is, a whole range of things. So we still need to have a good understanding of what's driving declines in many regions and many populations within the range, and that then creates that complexity. So I think the lessons we can learn from other plans and how we need to put things forward is, well, we need to leverage that knowledge across who's on the team, and that's where having a team that captures that entire understanding of what the requirements are for the species is going to be important. And I think that's probably something that a lot of the other recovery planning teams do. They look at where does the expertise lie, what are those people going to be bringing to the recovery team. I think we do need to make sure that the recovery team is not too big, because often things can get then lost in the milieu of discussion and things like that, where you then just start going around in circles because everybody's throwing in ideas and having a chat, but not really getting down to the nitty gritty to get things on paper to say, well, this is what we need to do now and this is what we need to do now. So while it's great that there's going to be the expression of interest and stuff, but I do think we probably need to have, I don't know if there's a guideline for how many people should be on a recovery team, but it's probably worthwhile to consider what their kind of threshold is going forward. So just a couple of thoughts there. Yeah.
Thanks, Guy. Tim's got his hand up. I'll come to you in a second, Tim, but I also just wanted to invite Trish Mooney to weigh into this conversation if you wanted to, Trish, before I go to Tim. Did you want to add your comments to this?
Yeah, I've just put a couple of things in the chat there. Interestingly, as Guy just mentioned, the recovery plan that we wrote. So this was written by Lynn Pedler and myself 20 years ago. And yes, we did have some key issues that we knew affected glossy black cockatoo recovery, such as the and recruitment, such as the possum predation at nests. But the recovery plan was a really good opportunity to summarise what we knew at that point of time, including the mapping that was available at the time, and then to come up with a whole range of different, fairly straightforward actions from protection of nests to targeted revegetation and just how that should be targeted. Obviously, it was a simpler process for us than it will be for you with your multiple projects all along the eastern seaboard, but it has been an incredibly useful document to have over the years. It gives us some sort of validity. We would, of course, like to update it, and there has been conversations with Kalia and the recovery program with the federal crew around funding over the last couple of years, but nothing's been available to date. But I guess a couple of key points to what's been raised. One, yes, regarding the recovery team, I think that you don't want hundreds of people in the recovery team. Probably having more than a dozen or so, it starts getting a bit unwieldy. It is important to, even without all the available, without all the sort of mapping and prioritization right across the subspecies range, which you won't have, the key recommendations to promote recruitment and recovery are probably similar across lots of different areas. I mean, you know less than we did, but you've already found out quite a bit. There is predation at nests. Yes, some of the habitat's been used, but not all of it. There are ways of prioritizing that habitat yeah, I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge document, is I guess one of the things that I would say.
Thanks, Trish. Great advice. Tim, you wanted to add something to the conversation?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to add just some reflection from experience in recovery planning in recent years on other species and that. I think it's really important I put a comment in saying, it's never the recovery plan. It's the recovery team that's the most important thing. They're the glue, that they're the ones that do all the action, that bring the people together, that try. And so the plan needs to be your leverage tool. It needs to have the correct flavor and the correct direction. And then it's you as a team that uses that in your leverage. And so just a few examples, like, I know we're talking a lot about Indigenous consultation, and I'm not fully up to speed around the cultural significance of this species or anything like that, but I do a lot of work in the arid zone on threatened mammals and great desert skinks and that, and the plans that we've done for those species have, the end user for actions to save the great desert skink and the bilby are Indigenous rangers on the ground, putting fire into the landscape and killing feral cats, right? So we need to think about with glossy black cockatoos, are they the end users are going to be implementing the actions to recover this species on the east coast of Australia? So what I'm hearing from the discussion is it's local governments, it's to do conservation, like sort of planning and stuff like that. So we need to think about what flavour does this plan have? If it's got a flavour around, Indigenous recognising in cultural significance is important, but it can't be full of that. It's got to have, what is the actual issue here? Is it about local government, so that when funding becomes available and you as a team, you start to work with local governments more? They're the people you really need to bring together all across the range. Or is it Forestry Corporation? Or it's just some food for thought, really, because, for example, grey-headed flying fox, a very similar range to the glossy black cockatoo, wide-ranging species. We put a lot of effort and resources into that over the years with recovery planning and thinking about, it's an issue, it's a local government issue. It's about managing problematic camps, poor planning, protecting the important resources. The end users are the local governments. They're what's going to drive the protection and management. So it's just some context. Every species is different, but you really need to think about here, like, the flavour of the plan, because you're going to be grabbing that as your leverage tool all the time as a team and go, we need this.
Yep.
Anyway, I'll stop there.
Great. Yeah, great insights, Tim. Thank you for that. And Dominique, who is Zooming in from Louisiana, has just asked, does the likelihood of government support increase if the recovery plan shows benefits for biodiversity more broadly, such as communities that co-occur with glossies? Do you have any insights on that, Eloise?
Yeah, it's often listed in our plans. We've often got a section for like co-benefits for other listed species. Off the top of my head, I can't recall if that's a requirement under the EPBC Act or if that's an optional section, but it's often included. And in terms of funding, it's often a question on federal funding applications. And I've seen it, like, when I've worked in the NGO space in other applications, where it's like, is there other co-occurring species that may benefit from these actions, and how? So yeah, it is always good to get a sense of how your actions are interacting within the ecological community where the species is present.
Thanks, Eloise. And Janet Carew, who is on the Conservancy's Management Committee, as well as running the Future Food for Glossies project on the Sunshine Coast, has shared that from her experience in implementing major change across state government, an important element is always using effective change management practices involving stakeholders, users and consultants, especially good and regular communication across these, as well as targeted training where necessary with input from users. So thank you for that, Janet. Were you going to add something to that, Adrian? And then I'm going to go to Danny.
No, I was just going to reiterate basically what Tim just said, and how critical it is to know that end user, how it's to be implemented, and who, and yeah, what is it that we're targeting? Because one thing, a recovery plan, we all know what a lot of the management issues are. It's how do you turn this around? What, as Guy talked to earlier, the limiting factors. What are the factors limiting the recovery of the species, and how do we address those factors that are limiting the rebounding of it? And how do we measure that? What is the measure? Because that's ultimately, we can all say, oh, we need to protect more hollow-bearing trees, or we need to put out more nest boxes. But how are we capturing how many nest boxes have gone out? How many of them are actually getting occupied by the species, and where is it working? And because that's ultimately showing that some of these actions are working. Because for me, if you want funding, the best way to get funding is to show what you're doing is working, than having something, oh, we think this is a good idea, can you give us some money to go and do it? If you can actually say, this works, this is how it happens, and here's all the great results that we've done with 10,000. Now give us 100,000 type thing. That's the sort of thing that's I think the recovery plan ultimately needs to be looking down the track at.
And in terms of end user or, actions that would have the biggest impact on the recovery of glossies, I think Spencer's summed it up beautifully in the chat, which is that habitat loss is the most significant problem for glossies. So thanks for that, Spencer. And Harry's also just commented that in northern New South Wales, in good, healthy glossy habitat, the team is also finding koalas, diverse eucalypt wet sclerophyll forests also benefit greater gliders, who are also habitat specialists, and both are endangered species. So lots of co-benefits there. Danny, haven't heard from you for a while. Lots of sitting back and listening. Thoughts on the conversation so far?
Yeah, many thoughts. Where do I begin? Following from what Adrian just said, it's going to be an interesting process because I totally agree. We need to get very clear on what we're measuring. And I think we need to know, what are we going to do when the data, hopefully we're collecting more monitoring data, for instance, what are we going to do when that suggests some kind of change in the population, whether that be good or bad? So I think David Lindenmayer talks about this quite a bit. We need sort of those trigger points for action. So we're starting out now. So this is quite a different situation to Kangaroo Island. There's heaps of lessons we're going to be taking from Kangaroo Island. Yep, all on board with everything Trish said. But it is a different situation. The problems are in some ways more difficult, and we'll be starting with sort of incomplete knowledge on the population. That's not to say we shouldn't do the very best job we can right now. We have to, and we're going to sort of push this recovery team and plan through fairly quickly. But over time, over the next few years, as the population perhaps changes or better data becomes available, what are we going to do with that knowledge? So I think we need to think about that a lot. I don't have those answers at this point, but I think it's a really important part of recovery planning. And then I guess something we haven't really touched on is the really big elephant in the room. The greatest problem of all is climate change, and how the hell do we manage that? Like, we need to think about very, very specific actions that we can sort of implement to address the key threats from climate change to glossies. So yes, absolutely, habitat loss, equally habitat degradation. So when we have drought and the she oaks are not producing as many cones and food becomes scarcer, the glossies change their behaviors as well during those times. How do we kind of deal with all of that? I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into how we deal with these huge, huge problems. And it's not, unfortunately, in some ways, as simple as, yep, possums are eating chicks on nests, let's collar all the trees. I don't think that's going to be necessarily the case here. So yeah, I think the scale of the issue is really, really large.
Thanks, Danny. And yeah, elephant in the room. It's so big that it actually hasn't been that much of a talking point over the last 2 days, because it's just so omnipotent, isn't it? It's just everywhere. Tim's just commented that it's great that we're talking about this, and Eloise asked a great question, which Danny or Guy, you might be able to answer, and that's whether there's been any climate modelling for the glossy black cockatoo. Danny,
Yeah, there has been a few. I can think of at least 3 different projects off the top of my head. Guy, you've been involved in some, I've been involved in some. It's all been kind of localized. So I think we probably need to relook at that, rethink some of the modelling approaches that we took. But yeah, definitely that should be part of this process. Absolutely. Yeah, and I can see Ryan's comment there about April. I totally agree. So yeah, I know April well, and we'll be chatting.
And there's always some new information to feed into those models, Eloise. So there's, like, for example, Gay's work on the soil stuff, for example, then how the soils may impact what's happening with the habitat. Yeah, a lot of the earlier models that we would have looked at, the climate modelling stuff, would have used existing habitat suitability models, but now those habitat suitability models might change based on the soil parameters that we add in. So now if we add soils into the new models, we might get different outputs and things. So I think, yeah, it's a moving space, but I think, yeah, we've got the tools available, so it shouldn't be that hard to update some.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's something we've been thinking about too, with the movement forward on a nature repair market and that pretty new area around nature finance. It's climate refuge area is something that would be really good to think about, and get that information out there, because it could potentially guide restoration efforts in strategic places. And, you know, obviously that market's really in its infancy, but it's definitely something to be thinking about in terms of future directions.
Thanks, Eloise. And Felicity's just commented in the chat that April's modelling was prepared for the ACT government. Were you going to add to that, Guy?
Oh, just a comment around the modelling and stuff, and say, for example, climate refuges and things. And that's where it becomes complex, because, for example, if we modelled refuges for fire, for example, which we know might become more frequent, more intense, for example, in the future, a fire refuge might be different from a drought refuge, where we need to also consider what's going to happen in reduced rainfall areas. So you may have, those impact areas might overlap quite dramatically, where you have fire and habitat that's been affected by drought being more intensely burned, but your drought and fire refuges might actually be located separately. So we need to consider, I'm not saying that they will be, it's just something that we need to think about in terms of the complexities of how we identify where these refuges might be in the landscape.
Thanks, Guy. And Diane's just said that April's delivered a presentation for the Lockyer catchment group on modelling of climate change and potential glossy black cockatoo refugia scenarios in Queensland. Thank you for that, Guy. Adrian.
Yeah, I don't know how to put my hand up. I'm so tech unsavvy.
So you did it old school.
Find it anywhere. It's just not there.
Yeah.
I got a feeling you blocked me from being able to do it. This is a general comment in some ways, and it goes back to what we're talking about. But the recovery plan and what comes from it, and the benefits for other conservation significant species, and there's other recovery teams who are writing similar documents and actions and stuff, and a lot of these plans, and a recovery plan for, say, flying foxes and black cockatoos, have got a third of it is exactly the same issue. It's the loss of eucalypt forest, it's the loss of this, it's loss of connections, and all of those sorts of elements that come into it. And I'm just keen to hear from Tim and Eloise. Do you see much collaboration between recovery teams? Do recovery chairs get a once a year get together and say, well, our biggest thing's this, and everybody else say, well, that's our biggest thing too. And instead of them all trying to do it independently, like the overall collaboration of all of those things that everyone's trying to do, is there any mechanism there where that happens, or should the glossy recovery team just start looking to reach out to the other recovery teams that are working in similar habitats and environments to see what they've got, what they're trying to do?
It's a good question, Adrian, and I think that's something like this whole recovery team registration and governance, and it's something that's evolving. And I think that's something that I've thought about for our team, is to be holding like recovery team forums and learnings and lessons learned and stuff like that. So that may happen, but definitely, I work on reptiles mainly, and I sit on grass Anilus dragon recovery teams, and we cross-pollinate with, say, Pygmy Blue Tongue recovery team in South Australia, and we get together and talk about, because we've got similar issues. We've got these ex situ captive breeding programs, and it's all about reintroduction into the wild. And so we're learning off each other and going, yeah, what have you learned? And, so if you've got to, you've got to figure out what that issue is that you want to collaborate on. And it may be, how do you work with forestry organisations? Good to make sure that the critical habitats are protected, and I don't know, whatever it is your crux issue, but there's always a lot of cross collaboration, particularly in the arid zone. I think you just got to figure out your problem, and then who else is dealing with the same problem, and work with them.
And so I'm thinking of scenarios where, there's some grant money out for, threatened species or that sort of theme, and you've got, for example, a glossy black recovery team applying for it, the flying fox recovery team, a koala recovery team, and they're all wanting to do very similar things and almost competing with each other. Whereas if they were combined, if those 4 or 5 recovery teams all were combined and said, this fits all 5 recovery plans, these are actions that we're trying to do, and it'll pick up all 5 of these species. It's going to make for a much more powerful sort of submission for any grant or funding, because it's covering more than one.
Yeah, and I think
the glossy
Adrian,
being the most
speaks...
important, of course.
Yeah, oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also that extends beyond just recovery teams as well. In the earlier session today, Sarah Legg was talking about NRM investment primarily being in that region, primarily being focused on koala habitat, but how you can strategically look at how can we incorporate glossy black cockatoo habitat restoration into these plans. And so, yeah, those connections, those really strong relationships with NRMs are so important, because there's often more sort of umbrella level funding, or you get a species like koala, which we know gets all of the funding, which is, you know, controversial, but it is, I mean, arboreal mammals, good umbrella species, there's always this opportunity to work within those projects and see where you can get those co-occurring benefits.
Yep.
Thanks, Eloise. Daniela's got a hand up, and so is Tim. So you guys want to arm wrestle for who goes next? I'll throw to you, Danny, and then I'll go to Tim.
Okay, there's just sort of a quick comment. I totally agree, Adrian. I think forming this recovery plan hopefully can be a bit of a I don't know, like a guiding resource for local actions, because what I've experienced firsthand many times is even within the glossy black community, we're competing with each other for a limited pool of funds, and it gets really tricky. So, I mean, sometimes this is just driven by the grant that you're applying for. So sometimes it's very much, you know, if you're not planting trees or putting up nest boxes, don't even bother. You know, we're not going to fund your science. Like, I've literally had that. And then in other cases, no, this is a research grant and we really kind of want to do some more of that exploratory research, and then we'll get funded. So I think it's really important that we all kind of work together. And I think having this recovery plan, you know, if we do hopefully do a really good job of putting it together, it will kind of guide, at least regionally, some of those collaborations to be the most effective, I hope. So everybody within, say, Southeast Queensland, we understand what the key priorities are here. We've hopefully got mapping. We've got some actions that we really need to implement, and we can work together to try and do that. Yeah, not just competing with each other, because we're all here for the same purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I mean, I'm coming to Tim now, but it's complicated when conservation groups more broadly are so desperate for funds that there is that divide and conquer kind of, you know, it's not even a mentality, it's just a survival tactic, where every small grant that you can take 10% admin from kind of helps keep the group afloat. Right.
Yeah, and sometimes you're fighting over $5,000.
That's exactly it. It's outrageous. It is absolutely outrageous. Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to go to Adrian's point. I think it's a good point, but I just wanted to reflect that and sort of try and help you where your overlap might be in terms of that collaboration. And, you know, like say we've got the same range, grey-headed flying foxes, southeast glossy, you know, some significant overlaps with parrots, region honeyeaters, all this investment, you know, everyone's going for the same money. But, you know, you got to figure out your uniqueness. Like grey-headed flying foxes, we narrowed it down through over years and years, and all the hard work of Peggy Eby and Brad Law, and it's like, there's a bottleneck in winter flowering resources. You know, that's what we're trying to protect. Winter flowering, there's a shortage of it. You know, so we've identified the tree species. That's our focus. You've got to focus, obviously, with cockatoos, with Alocasuarina species. So, you know, it's very different. So that's where you got to figure out what's your thing that you're going for. It's around Alocasuarina resources, potentially, and your breeding trees, obviously, with your hollows and that. But figure it out, because then you've got pretty big overlap potentially. That was in the comments before, and we'll get you some information, but with ecological communities along the east coast of Australia, and those communities having those resources in them, and opportunities to co-sync with those, you know, people that are protecting those communities, or botanical people, you know, like because you know, we've got the coastal swamp oak forests of southeast Australia listed as a community. There's probably some overlap there. Yeah, all those types of forests down southeast. So I think it's just, the message is that there's the uniqueness, and you've got to identify that, and that's how you get your best bang for your buck in those applications and stuff like that.
Bringing
we can obviously help. hopefully.
Yeah.
But
bring in those, the threatened ecological communities like the swamp eucalypt forests and things into these are going to also benefit from the actions of this plan, because there's no doubt that the species occurs quite regularly in those same environments. So there's crossover
that's right.
there.
And it has a really significant role to play, keystone species potentially, like finding that real marketing connection with those communities. And then, because obviously, they're a big protection layer over the glossy black cockatoo habitat, and that's how you'll get your story, and get funding.
Thanks, Tim. Just a reminder, if you've got any questions for the panel, to drop them in the chat, and also if you kind of kick them back listening in, you could use this time to complete an evaluation form, hint, hint. I wanted to ask the panel, and I've also dropped this question in the chat if any of our participants would like to weigh in, but we've heard about some voices that have been missing from this conversation. I'm just wondering if there are any others. Danny, I'll go to you first and then I'll go to Guy. So we've heard about First Nations land management practices that we might be able to incorporate into recovery planning. Are there any other voices that are missing from this conversation or have been missing from the forum?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely traditional owners need to be involved in some capacity. Definitely the agricultural sector as well. I think we had a whole session yesterday on conservation and agricultural landscapes. So I think that's going to be important. And I'm really keen to hear from other people on other recovery teams. So I think Kangaroo Island Glossy is a good example, but more broadly than that, I think there'll be a lot of shared lessons that we can learn from other recovery teams. So golden shoulder parrot's probably a good one. Malleefowl, red-tailed black cockatoos. There's quite a few that have fairly, I think, effective recovery teams and recovery plans. And I'm keen to hear how they operate.
Thanks.
Yeah, certainly not just the biologists in the room.
Thanks, Danny. And from what our Australian government friends were saying, perhaps regional NRM organisation representative on our recovery team might be a good idea as well. Guy, any voices that you've noticed have been missing from this conversation in the last couple of days?
I think, it's different. I mean, we've had certainly input from, national and state level government and stuff, but it may be, if we're going down to local government as well. I know there are some local government, members and stuff here from local councils, for example, and we certainly have council representation on the Conservancy. But it'll be worthwhile to be, if local councils plus NRM agencies and traditional owners and private landholders, it comes back down to who's going to be doing the work on the ground when we roll out a recovery plan. And if it's not necessarily going to be the academics who have one or two students, it's going to be the agencies with more manpower potentially and more feet on the ground to go and plant trees and do whatever. So there are potentially other voices to consider when we think about just how we're going to actually implement what we're proposing later on down the track. So we have got some representation, but we may need to cast the net a bit wider, I think, to make sure everybody across the entire range is included in those different groups.
Thanks,
because I mean,
Guy, and
the councils, for example, like here in Queensland, the councils have got an overarching council steering committee or statutory body advisory board or group or whatever. That may be the same in New South Wales. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Guy. And Spencer's just dropped in the chat that we can't forget our young people in terms of having a voice around the table as well. What about you, Adrian? Do you feel like there's voices who've been missing from the conversation during this forum, or that we might forget to include in the team?
There's two obvious ones, and there's the politicians, but we're not going to get them to this forum. They don't have the time to sit here for 2 days, but ultimately they're the ones who need to hear and understand all these issues that we're talking about. And you can go so far as to say the other 26.5 million people who live in Australia who aren't here and don't understand these issues. But a lot of them don't live in the range of the bird, but certainly having that general coverage and the general person out there is because we're all sitting here for the last 2 days talking to each other. We're preaching to the converted, but how do we get that to the I use the term the great unwashed out there, and have them understand what these issues are and how real these issues are and what they can do in their backyards and their properties and all of that. They're the ones that, you know, it would be great to somehow have the Farmers Federation on this forum and have all of these sorts of other industry groups listening to some of this. Yeah.
And Barbara Hamilton agrees with you and says, yes, we need to engage the non-birders.
Yeah.
Eloise and Tim, do you feel like there's other voices that recovery teams often forget to include that maybe feel a little bit disengaged down the track?
Well, just following on from Adrian's point about wanting to have the politicians involved, I think it is really important to form relationships with your representatives at the local level. That's, you know, local, state and federal representatives. I guess I'm not really saying that as a public servant, but just as someone that's previously worked in NGOs. So don't take that as like my official advice. But yeah, I mean, just forming those personal relationships and keeping them updated about what their constituents are doing and what they value is really important, particularly at certain times of the election cycle. I'll stop talking now.
Yeah. Thanks, Eloise. Tim?
Yeah, a few ideas from me is I think, you know, we often get stuck in that urban space and that residential and the land clearing and all that and protected areas and forestry, whereas with this species I think maybe, you know, someone that's missing is our it's at the government level, but it's like the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, the local land services that are working with private agricultural landholders to do, you know, they set aside property, they've got stewardships, that's where some funding opportunities are too under that, you know, local land service, maybe Biodiversity Conservation Trust. There's similar things in Victoria, Trust for Nature. You know, it's those kind of people that are in that agricultural space we're often forgetting, and we focus on that urban local council, and it's like there's big gains in the agricultural space for big parcels of habitat, you know?
Yep.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Tim. I think so much of, the attention has been on like the most coastal populations, but in fact, I think some of the biggest gains can be had further out west.
Yeah.
Another comment from Janet in the chat. She said similar to what Tim just said. Another group is bush regenerators and on-ground workers who've always been a great source of information about habitat and sightings. And Spencer has just popped in a reminder that that's why he shares his message with his nearly 20,000 followers on social media. Thank you for that awesome advocacy work, Spencer. I'm just wondering if there's any final comments for the panel. Otherwise, we will start to wrap this conversation up. Diane has just said at the end of the day, habitat restoration happens on private and public land. So it's the landowners who are critical and need to be convinced and engaged in glossy conservation. Thank you for that, Diane. Great observation. If there's no other questions from the panel, Danny, I wanted you to just sum up and then I'll just pop the evaluation link in the chat one more time. Your vision in terms of this recovery plan for glossy black cockatoos. I mean, we've had a huge discussion about it, but, you know, what are you thinking and feeling now after this chat?
What am I thinking and feeling? I think we've got a big job ahead of us. I think getting the right mix of people on the recovery team is going to be very, very important. I'm really keen to strike the right balance, like I said, of action and planning. And I'm thinking both sort of short to medium term, but at longer term as well. I think that's going to be very, very important. So what are the things we can do today, say the next 5 to 10 years, but what are our goals for the species in 50 years time or even 100 years time? So, you know, well past our lifespans, where do we want that species to be? So what are the steps we can take today to kind of get to that goal? And ultimately, what we should be doing is aiming for the species to no longer be listed. This kind of gets to my original question to Tim around, you know, having some statutory protection is really appealing and people might not want the species to no longer be listed. But really, in terms of an outcome, that's the goal. That's where we want to go. We don't want this species to be relying on us. We would love it if they didn't need to be, but that's certainly not the case today. There's so much work that needs to be done, but wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great if it didn't have to?
I don't think there's anyone who would disagree with that sentiment, Danny. And I know from strategic planning with hundreds of not-for-profit conservation groups that always comes up in strategic planning. It's like, what's our goal as an organisation? It's to not have to be here. Eloise has just said there's a problem with the evaluation form. I will check that out again, Eloise. I think I had already thought I'd already fixed it today, but I'll fix that again. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our speakers, Jed, Eloise, Tim, and Adrian. Thank you to the panelists, Daniela and Guy. And thank you so much to all of the participants who have put such awesome comments and conversations in the chat, like Nicole. I'll just share this as we're wrapping up. We can't forget the importance of continuous education of the public, as they are often the biggest combined landholders and land managers. And she says she's always surprised that she can still say to residents, do you know about glossy black cockatoo or any other threatened species? And the answer is still no. So as somebody else said in the chat a few moments ago, Kelly Roche, we've got a massive job ahead. But if anything, over the last couple of days, we've done a really good job of building those connections and sharing knowledge so generously. So we're definitely in a better position now, hopefully, than we were 48 hours ago.